Okay, my name is Joy May, and I married Charles Knight, wherever he went. There he is. And so I'm known as Joy May Knight. When I was introduced to people with just Joy May, they would ask, what is your last name? What's your name? Joy May. What's your last name? So it was good to finally get a last name that was recognized. When I have thought about the kinds of things that we do with our genealogical obsession, I was trying to picture where have these family members been, and I was trying to locate, what part of the world they came from, and I got my ancestry done, and my brother did the FTDNA, so we had the lineage, from the Y chromosomes there. And I learned that our last name was actually M-A-Y-O when we first came to America. And so I thought that was interesting, but that's number one rule of genealogy is spelling doesn't count. It's how it sounds, and so that was an interesting kind of thing. Also with surnames, they didn't use surnames until about, they came over with William the Conqueror in 1066 because everybody starts, that's our start date. Because when he came, he really put things in order. If you have an opportunity and some time, you might want to look it up online, but there is the entire Domesday book has been placed online, and it's fascinating reading for nerds and people that enjoy this kind of thing. And I have a lot of representations over here, and I know there's a lot of words, but I also have a reference point for each of the pictures that's here. And I thought if you took a picture of it with your phone, then you could research it later and take a closer look if that was something you were interested in. But the surname idea, they used patronymics for a long time, up till about 1100 AD. And that was, you assumed the first name of your father, because he didn't have a last name either. Okay, so my name's John, and my father's name is Thomas, so my name would be John Thomas. But my father's name was Thomas, and his father's name was Charles, so he would be Charles Thomas, and I'm John Thomas. So you really couldn't follow a lineage in that manner because nobody went anywhere in those days most of the time. And so it was easy to keep your family names together because there weren't many around. Then when things began to happen with the large movement of people from different places in Europe and the British Isles and other places, it became more important to know to whom they belonged because we come from a long line of avid record keepers. That's one thing about the genealogical process, that you can say thank you for our English forebears because they wrote it all down. It's amazing. So after the patronymics kind of went away, they decided that they would use things like where a person lived. So if you lived near a meadow, your name might be John Meadow, or a brook, or whatever physical characteristic was around a river. Lay would be like a meadow in another language. So in looking at that, that was okay if you were like local. But then again, when you start to branch out into other areas, that was maybe didn't always work. Maybe it was a job. So you might become Nancy Baker because her father was a baker, this kind of thing. So, and they also used physical characteristics. Now some of them were kind of insulting, but you could use that as a guide. And for us, that's what happened with the Russ family. R-U-S. If you got your ancestry information, they show the Vikings coming through. And they were known by that name, Russ, Roos, Rose, Rouse, all of those derivatives. And it meant red. So somebody along the way had red hair. And we all inherited that name because of that physical characteristic. which is kind of interesting. I was mentioning earlier today that when my daddy, who looked like Khrushchev, he was bald and had a little, ribbon of white hair around. It was brown at one point, I guess. But when he would grow a mustache, it was bright red. Who knows? Go figure. So anyway, we got the names of people out of the way. Now, looking at where they lived. How long is my trail here? Not long. Okay, so with William the Conqueror, there were a lot of people that came across that have sort of a derivation of that name. I didn't put the ones from the Battle Abbey roll up here, but you can check out the Battle Abbey roll, and there's like 12, 15 names of that variation that came with William the Conqueror in 1066. He came over to England because he had a cousin who was on the throne, and when he died, they had made an agreement that he was going to get the throne. Harold of Denmark, a lot of Danish people were in the British Isles at that point. Anyway, they had a war. I've got the map here that shows where they went. But when he came across, these knights came with him, not K-N-I-G-H-T last name, but that was their job. And their last name was some derivation of R-U-S. So we've got several here. He came from Rouen in Normandy. So he came right across the strait there, and one contingency came up. Do I have a map here? You know what, Grace? You can sleep on the job. I need a map. No, don't scroll yet. If you think about the British Isles, to the left side you have Wales, and then just below that you have the area. Did any of you watch Poldark on Sunday night? And where is Poldark from?
Cornwall.
Cornwall. That little extension on the British Isles that goes out to the West Point is considered Cornwall, and with their copper mines. And there was a contingency with William the Conqueror, who landed on that side and came up into Devon, Dorset, Wiltshire. And then there was another contingency that came up into the right-hand side of the British Isles. We're going to see a map in a minute when we get rolling. The Essex at the lower end near London, then Suffolk above that, and then Norfolk above that. So our family has two potential trails that they may have come from. We have seen the family of Rheingold Russ as being a potential ancestor. From the information that I got, I'm kind of like not leaning in that direction now. So, but that's always a possibility because they didn't actually keep those kinds of records. I've been trying to track, and it goes back to Maine, M-A-Y-N, back in the time when they were just adding names. And he had a son named Alain, and Alain became Alain de Maine, and so you see how confusing it could get. But we'll talk more about that in a minute. Anyway, growing up, I used to think, now, who do I look like? Well, let's see. I can see my mama's hands, Oh, I may have my daddy's eyes, that kind of thing. Has anybody ever mentioned that to you? They say, oh, when I look at you, darling, I see, somebody in your family. Well, the problem is that we don't know what they look like exactly. We only know those by parts. But within this group, we could create one of those ancestors right here, because each one of us might have a piece of that person that we could show and we could demonstrate. So I think it's interesting when we get together like this, because it's not only kind of like edifying for us as an individual, but it's also good for us as a group to kind of renew our vows with each other as a family. And that, to me, is a big thing. Anyway, after I met Sperry, maybe it was just before I met you at the reunion a couple of years ago, I was saying, I have my daddy's nose. And he said, well, I have my daddy's nose. So I went back and I found a picture. And this is my father, Sam D. May, as a young man. And this is these are my doppelgangers, I think. Anybody know who this is?
Yep, it's Ruby Jones Rush.
Ruby Jones Russ, that's right. And why was, because he's,
That's not rigged this year.
no, because he's also related to Ruby Jones
Well,
Russ.
you know,
Big way.
you're talking about the noses. Well, I got one picture of my dad in a fireman's, that's his dress uniform, by a pumper truck. I put it on my Facebook, and my half-brother on my mother's side wrote on there, well, we can see who you look like, or something like that. Because my mother always told me, 'cause my dad died when I was 4, so I didn't
So
know
you
him.
didn't really know
She
him.
says, you look just like your father.
Well, there you go. See, it happens for all of us. Okay, Chris, pass it on. So, keep going. Oops, it reduced. You can't, you have to be purposeful here, I think.
I blew up that.
So I wanted to know, where in the world has our family been? So we've gone from Normandy over to England. So the Russ family really started off as Vikings. They became French at some point, and then they moved into the British Isles, and our ancestry starts with the group that was there for sure. Because then, here, this is the English Channel through here. Over here is Rouen. I think that's how you spell it. I never took French in high school. Anybody do?
That's good.
Is that close enough? Okay, thank you. We won't hurry along, right? So they came either into this area here, Devon, Dorset, and up into Wiltshire, or they may have come on this side up into Suffolk, Norfolk, Essex, down here by London. Okay, next. Now, when we're looking at the United States, and is there a way you can scroll down that picture, just not go to the next one? I can do it with, well, no, that's all right. Okay, this is what the United States looked like in the early part of the 1600s. So we have the stripes represents the French territories. The yellow here, or orangey maybe, is more of the English and Dutch settlement. And then the yellow down here had to do with the Spanish. Now, in 1603, Elizabeth died, but just before she died, she said, you know, everybody's got free reign. Go find us some new lands and go exploring, and anything you find that doesn't belong to a Christian prince, then you can claim it for jolly old England. Okay, go to the next one. And at that point in time, money was bad. They were having a hard time, and all of a sudden the idea of this new market opening up, always follow the money, right? There was a big push. In England, they were setting up all of these different groups that were sponsoring groups that were going to come to America. Go ahead. And in 1630, a group of you know, we hear about the Pilgrims. Well, the Pilgrims came in 1607, and bless their hearts, they were so pitiful and so poor and had not planned very well, and they starved. They really had a rough time. But in 1630, things were pretty rough in England, so another group called the Puritans, and they're called the Puritans because they were trying to purify the Catholicism out of their way of life, because remember Henry VIII got rid of that, right? So in 1630, they planned a trip, and the ship over there, it comes from a little picture like this big, so I wanted you to be able to see it. They planned a group to come over to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they had 11 ships that arrived that summer of 1630. They went from timber. Okay. They went from only a handful. Here. They went from only a handful of. You've got this on there. Go to the next one. Right there. A handful of people in the Americas, or what would soon become the United States, and they had to travel by boat to get over here. You notice that the lines going across and the lines going up and down are equal. That was the problem for travel in those times, because they only knew how to figure latitude. Well, longitude has a little different kind of thing, and you can go off by a degree or two and it ends up being hundreds of miles. when you're comparing it to what it should be to the earth. So had a lot of problems with that travel. Scurvy was such a big problem. No, well, that's fine. You can take it. The problem with scurvy is that the health of the people was so bad. I mean, you begin to bleed, and then Dr. May, you can help us with that one. The idea of it being a problem just while they traveled. I've got a list of the foodstuffs that they were allowed to take, and it doesn't amount to much, and it's mostly like beef or pork and peas. That was pretty much what they had to eat. And they didn't realize that they needed the fruits and vegetables, or they liked them, but they didn't realize that it made a difference for them, because even after the Pilgrims arrived, they died off for several months just from the scurvy that they contracted from not having the right kind of food. So it was vicious. So traveling for 75 days to get from here to here was a very difficult thing. And the ships were not built at that time for people to travel in it. It was only built for what they had used it for, carrying goods or maybe soldiers or that kind of thing. So it was pretty uncomfortable, very cold because of where they were, and making that trip was difficult. Go ahead to the next one. Okay, go ahead. So they came to the vicinity of Boston, and during that year, 17 ships came, but over that summer of 1630, 11 ships came. We don't have, and I haven't been able to find, John Russ, and I'm putting the numbers after them on this so you'll know what generation they are. So John the First came, and when he came in 1634, because a group of men in Wiltshire, along with two ministers for the Congregational of the Anglican Church, they decided that they wanted to set up a business called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he came in between April 1634 and July of 1635. Okay, keep going. And keep going, don't need that one. Go ahead, go ahead. Okay, I put this one in here just for a detail. I found John Russ, R-U-S-S-E, and that's how they spelled it when they first came here, as being born in Wiltshire. So I'm beginning to think that maybe our early beginnings started with a group in Wiltshire, England, which is kind of like in the middle if you exclude Wales. Okay, go ahead. And, oh wait, no, go back. The reason I'm saying that is because the refugees or the immigrants that came settled in places together. So there was a group that came from Wiltshire, England, and when they came over here, they tended to settle along the Merrimack River, on the southern edge of the Merrimack River. There was another group that came from Dorset that had ended up in the south part of Boston, and they came from Dorchester. And guess what they named their new town in the United States? Dorchester. So that happened with a lot of these groups. They used the same name, so it was like, I never left home. I'm still same mailbox. So the reason I mention those is because they will give us something in the future. Okay, St. Andrew's Parish in Wiltshire is where that John Russ was born. So I thought that was interesting. Give us a little view of that. When they came over, of course, the Indians were here, and they had already named the places because they'd been here for a long time. And we decided, well, no, that won't do because I'm from Dorchester and I need to be in Dorchester again. So they all created their own new names. So Ipswich, which is where John the First came to, was called Agawam, and Newberry was Coscapunkin, and Boston, well, let's see, no, Andover was Cochitawiki. Say that 3 times. Fast. So anyway, they had their own names. Keep going. And this is how they showed up. Here's Ipswich. Then they came to Newberry, which is up here, and this is here's the Merrimack River right here. And they were there for a while, and then over here under the Merrimack Bend is where they set up camp in Andover, Massachusetts. Okay, go ahead. Now, if you wanted to have a town, you had to fulfill some regulations here. Okay, so you had to have at least 10 freeholders. The freeholders were men who were not conscripted in any way, and they were not, having to pay bondage for having made the trip or that kind of thing. They were free persons who could earn their own living and could help establish a town. So they had to build the meeting house first, because the church was in charge of not only the ecclesiastical kind of business, but they were also in charge of the civic duties as well. Voting, taxes, land ownership, everything had to go through that meeting house or the church that they had. They also had, you were encouraged to tell on your neighbors if they were not doing what they were supposed to do. So they would, well, I don't know, a little bit did, because they would report it, and then they would kind of have to like pay a penance. They would have to do some kind of duty, and there's a couple of stories about some of our Russ friends and family who had been caught drinking, and they had to do some civic duties in order to pay for their crimes. And also you had to have the setup for housing and the pastures so that they were not together. For example, the houses were clustered together in like little villages, but out from the village were the pasture lands and the open areas that are called commons that they could use for other kinds of things. So it was set up quite differently from what we're doing now. Okay, go ahead. Keep going. I thought that was interesting, making a fashion statement, right? But it was so cold up there. Can you imagine them? Well, they were coming from England, so that's pretty chilly too. So I guess they figured that one out. Go ahead. Okay, so John the First was the immigrant to America who brought his family to Essex County, Massachusetts. See, they're using the same names. He arrived in Ipswich in the winter of 1634, and he went on to Newbury in 1635. And then by 1641, he was in Andover. As early as 1643, John Russ had charge of the ferry in Newbury. He petitioned for reimbursement because he was having to carry the people who were statesmen, having to work on the government and that kind of thing, who might be passing through going to Boston. And he was not real happy about having to carry these people for free. So he solicited the group that could reimburse him for that, and they did decide to reimburse him. And I've got a little thing over here that explains, how he went about doing that. So we know he was there. There's a lot of information about John Russ being in Andover. Go ahead. The interesting thing for me was that our John the First was born in 1611, and guess what else happened in 1611? King James Bible was printed. That opened up a whole new world for people being able to read or have something to read, and his whole goal was to have it to serve as the centerpiece. He didn't want a lot of different little translations or this and that other person's ideas about what that text meant. He set it up, and they used a battery of 8,000 words that they repeated over and over so that it had that repetition. People could make sense of it, they could understand it. And I thought this was so interesting. The most repeated English sentence is, "Our Father which art in heaven." Isn't that amazing? Okay, so Elizabeth died in 1603. King James I came in. He had been King James VI of Scotland, so Scotland came into our group. So a lot of things happened about that time in history. Go ahead. Go ahead. King Charles he came later, and it was bad, not good, and they ended up taking care of him. This is a map of Ipswich, Massachusetts, and right here, smack dab in the middle, is John Russ. He is in lot number 34. Isn't that cool? Go ahead. Now, when you look at it a little bit bigger, this is Newberry, and it's B-U-R-Y, but you might see it B-E-R-R-Y. There is also the ferry right up here, and that was what he ran. Across the street from the cow common. Good place to be, right? Smell good, I'm sure. Go ahead. Okay, and then I found this little 8.5 by 11 picture of Andover map, and I was like, oh. When I was able to see it big enough, I thought, this is so interesting. So I'm very infantile, I guess, in a way, but I put the pieces together on that farm map, and I marked the places because I also came across the list of Charlotte Helen Abbott had put together these little vignettes, I guess you'd say, of the different families that started Andover. And she had one on the Russ family, and the numbers on the side have a colored numbered designation, and then on the map itself it shows you where the Russ family had land. And the I don't know, I just found that awfully interesting. But the lake here was called, it was referred to as the Big Lake, but nowadays it's called Lake, ready? Wiki, just like the name that they ended up using to begin with. But if you go up into New England, one of the things that impressed me most was how close everything is. You know, living in Florida, we go like, what, 6 hours to go across the top and 6 or 7 hours to go down the length of the peninsula. So it was interesting to me that, you know, you would be 10 minutes away, 30 minutes away from something, and it was just right there, all right there together. Go ahead. So the first settlers set up their everything. They had to have approval for a plantation. So they set up their plantation just below the Merrimack, which you see there in the top of that drawing. And it was southwest of the Great Pond where they settled. And the priority for the settlers was to build a garrison house. What would a garrison house be? Anybody got any ideas?
Is that a military thing?
It sounds like a military thing, doesn't it? Well, essentially what it is, it's sort of a dormitory, but it was for their safety, so that when the Indians were having a problem with their new visitors, the people could go into the garrison and they could stay there, and they did for periods of time. Okay, go ahead. But they also used block houses, and the block house was more like a smaller place, but it had conveniently located holes so that you could stick a musket out and, you know, they could protect themselves. So it was more like a war situation, but they also used the garrison house. Go ahead. This is from the history of Andover, and it says that it was a necessity, especially in the Shawshin fields, that river that goes vertical on the left-hand side is called the Shawshin. And those fields down on the left-hand side, they didn't have any protection, so they had to build a garrison house there, and it's one of the green dots there on the left that shows where their garrison house was. So that's you'll know why that's important in a minute. Okay, go ahead. That explains the difference what I just said. But this is a picture of the garrison house, and I was like, that wasn't what I was expecting. But anyway, they sure did know how to build, even at that time. Amazing. Go ahead. So John I had a son named John II. John II was born in Newberry, but he lived in Andover until he passed away about 1715. He married Deborah Osgood. Now, if you ever look up the Osgood family, you're going to be saying, I am related to the Osgood family, because anybody know what Citibank is? You ever heard of Citibank?
Yeah.
Well, her uncle took care of that. He started it at the beginning. He also had the finest house that could be had at the time, and that's where George Washington lived when he was first our president. So John Russ had a bunch of, I think, 13 children. A lot. Okay, go ahead. And also, John I was the ferryman, right? Well, John II was a miller. He had a mill that was set up on the a grist mill to start with on the Shawshin River. And this house is where they lived on the location. Now, the house was rebuilt in 1900, but at 69 Shawshin Road, that was their land, and it's right smack dab in the middle of that map. That's where they lived. I was just like, wow, I thought I'd been there. Go ahead. Okay, go ahead, I don't care about this. The Puritans, though, as holy as they might seem, they were trying to not have to do everything like somebody else wanted them to do, but they also had the idea that everybody needed to do what they wanted them to do. And because of that, they did not welcome new groups in, and they were really hostile to Quakers. Quakers were making an inroad into Pennsylvania and that area at the time, and it was bad. They cut off their ears, and it was bad. Okay, go ahead. This is the North Church at Andover. There's a story about the North Church in that because of the growth of the area, they needed to expand, and there was a big problem about building a South Church because everybody wanted to maintain that control, right? You've probably heard that in civic situations. Go ahead. This is just a picture of the cemetery that goes with the Old North Church. And then in 1711, they founded the South Church. Now, John I died in 1692. He was 80 years old, and John II died in 1717, or 1715. So he didn't have much time to be a part of that parish, but he was there for a little bit. Go ahead. And there's a picture of the South Church. Go ahead. Now, I thought this was interesting. How many Methodists do we have in here? Any Methodists? Well, the Methodist Church has a rule that a preacher can only stay for 4 years, and then they bring in new blood, and everybody has to get used to that. It's always a thing. Well, this gentleman, Reverend Samuel Phillips, was at the South Church. This is how long he served. From 1711, he served till 1771. That's not his birth and death date. He served 60 years in that one church. So I thought that, I don't know if that would fly this day of time. Go ahead. Okay, King Philip's War. Here are these poor Indians sitting here, and all these immigrants come in. Well, it wasn't too bad at first, and they kind of got along. Things were okay. And they used wampum. I thought that was kind of like a joke for cowboy movies or something. But no, they did not have a system of coinage or paper money. They had to have a way to be able to sell things and buy things. And they would have these strings of wampum, things that they valued, different kinds of shells, had different kinds of value. So they were selling their land thinking that they were coming out on the good end of things. But over time, when they came, thousands and thousands of people arrived in a very short amount of time. And not only did they bring themselves and all that they had, but they brought along disease. And they just about obliterated the native population just by their very presence. So things were getting hot, and this is what happened with King Philip's War. King Philip was an Indian or a Native American. It was not an Englishman. Okay, go ahead. Okay, you can go ahead because I've talked about that. Okay, now here we come to the Wilson manuscript. Now, I hope y'all don't go to sleep on me. Where did it go? Oh, here it is. This first one. But John Russ II, we're not supposed to be over here. John Russ II had, excuse me, I'm tangled. All right, maybe yes, maybe no. How many things could, okay, here we go. Andrew Peters was an Englishman who came from Holland. He landed in Boston while it was a village, the streets being merely country roads. He was hopping from stone to stone through the streets to avoid the mud holes when he looked up and saw a young lady standing at the window of one of the village homes. He thought to himself, I will marry her, if possible. She was also looking with an eye of partiality on the young Englishman as he nimbly skipped along the street. Not long after, a favorable opportunity was offered, and he became acquainted with the amiable young lady, Miss Mercy Beamsley, and he married her. He then moved to Andover, Massachusetts, where he established a distillery, becoming quite rich, and raised a family of 5 sons and 3 daughters. The Indians at that time were very troublesome and killed many of the inhabitants, among whom were 2 of this Mr. Peters' sons. They had been out in the fields at work, and they were returning to the village when 2 Indians who had been scouting discovered them. The Indians immediately hid behind a log fence, telling their captive, John Singleton, if he stirred or made any noise, they would kill him on the spot. As the young men rode by, the Indians fired. One fell from the horse dead. The other was shot through the body. The ball passed through the horse's neck, which set off at a full gallop, causing the blood to spurt from the wound of the young man at every jump. The Indians were continually making such inroads upon the property of the inhabitants of his early days, and it rendered them almost impossible for them to secure a comfortable supply of food for their families. Because remember, the houses are up here, and the cows and the growing fields are in another location. So they always had to carry their guns into the fields when they were working, so as to have them near at hand. For more than 30 years, they had to pursue this method, the Indians continually destroying all they could lay their hands on, burning their buildings, driving away their cattle, and murdering inhabitants on sight. Okay, so that gives you the big picture. William Peters, the 3rd son of Andrew and Mercy Beamsley Peters, was born in Andover in 1672. He married Margaret, the 3rd daughter of John Russ of Andover, about the year 1694, and in 1696 they'd been married 2 years. They established their home not far from his father's home, and it's on the map. In August, Miss Margaret Peters went to their house to pick berries for dinner. After she returned to the garrison, the Indians came to the house and hid themselves in the cornfield. After dinner, William Peters decided to go to the home to take care of his horse, which was lame. After dinner, Margaret was very anxious to go with him, but it began to rain, and he told her it would not do for her to go. Their young son John was just a babe, 10 months old. She, however, felt anxious to go with him and followed him out of the house, saying she could go, the rain would not hurt her. He saw she was anxious and turned around and in a very tender manner replied, "No, my dear, you must not go. The grass is very wet, and you'll wet your feet and catch cold." He told her he would go to his father's home and bring back a fat lamb on the horse so that she might see him, and she just watched him until he went out of sight. William went to the house, led out his horse, and stood fixing his hoof, when 9 Indians rushed upon him. They seized him and carried him into the house, where a Mr. Hoyt was making ropes. They instantly knocked Hoyt down and scalped him. To Mr. Peters, they handed a pair of moccasins and told him to put them on and accompany them. He sat down and began to tie the moccasins, carefully watching for an opportunity to make his escape. The Indians were very busy plundering the house, and when Peters saw the doorway clear, he sprang forward, knowing if he could get out, he could outrun the Indians. He had previously had several races with them. Unfortunately, the pole on which Hoyt had hung his hemp was so low that he hit his head against it and fell back. The Indians sprang upon him with their hatchets. He made a gallant defense, throwing down 3 of them. Then the 4th struck him over the eye with the head of the hatchet and broke his skull. They scalped him, gathered their booty, and fled. The Indians, from whom an account of this affair was afterwards obtained, said that they washed the scalps in rainwater which had caught on the heads of some cider barrels that stood near the door. Mrs. Peters had become uneasy at the length of time that had elapsed since the departure of her husband. As hour after hour passed away, her fears for his safety increased. They only laughed at her fears. About sunset, one of the young men of the fort started to bring the cows from the pasture. Mrs. Peters could bear the suspense no longer, and as the young man would follow a path near her house, she said she would go with him. They walked along in silence until they came to the path which would separate them. She told him he must go with her. She dared not go alone. and without saying a word, he stepped into the path before her and walked towards the house. When they came within sight of it, they were surprised to see the hogs, which usually ran in the woods and were very wild, were around the house, and one of them appeared to be feeding upon something that lay in the doorway. As they came nearer, the path led them in such a direction that they could not see the front part of the house. When the young man, who was a few steps in advance, came around the corner of the house, he turned suddenly with an exclamation of terror and fled. Mrs. Peters ran with him several rods and then stopped and asked what he had seen. "I saw," he said, "blood on the heads of the barrels, and the hogs were eating Mr. Hoyt's head." Terrible as this description was, it afforded a gleam of hope. "Did you see anything else?" "I thought I saw a heap of cloth within." That hope sustained her, and she sank helpless upon the ground. The young man caught her up and carried her towards the fort. His approach was observed by the inmates of the garrison, who came out to meet him and assist in conveying Miss Peters into their little fortress. Happily for her, she did not come back to consciousness for any considerable length of time during that night and for several succeeding days. 3 men armed themselves and went to the house. They found Mr. Hoyt partly out of the door with his head nearly gone. The body of Peters was lying on the floor where he fell. One of the men raised him in his arms and thought he felt the heart beat, but it soon ceased. They laid him down again, and being too few in number to carry the bodies to the fort, placed the remains of Mr. Hoyt within the house, closed the door, and left them until morning, when they were brought in and buried. Margaret Russ Peters thus early was left a widow with 1 child. She had several offers of marriage. Her kindness and agreeable manners secured the attachment of father and children. Her second marriage was a happy union for 50 years. I just found that story so compelling because of the times that our ancestors had to go through and the things that they endured for us to be here. It just, I don't know, just blew me away. Anyway, I hope I didn't bore you too much on that. Go ahead. But it's known as the Wilson manuscript, if you want to look it up. Okay, the most severe and distressing shock which Andover ever suffered with the Indians was on the 5th of March, 1698, when between 30 and 40 Indians surprised the town and killed 5 persons. They burnt 2 houses and 2 barns with the cattle in them. They set another dwelling house and the meeting house on fire, but the fires were happily extinguished before they did too much damage. And that was the kind of life that they were having to live, just to stay alive. So this is also from the history of Andover. Go ahead. So that group had their troubles, and this is all about the same time because the witch trials were in 1692. And this was kind of like an episode of Mean Girls. This bunch of teenage girls from a neighboring city, which was around, Salem is usually the name you hear associated with this, but they had made people believe that they knew how to detect witches. And these girls were going from town to town. Ministers were bringing them in because they wanted to know who was doing the wrong thing. And the girls would lay hands on them and declare whether or not these people were witches. It just totally turned the community upside down. I mean, we're still talking about it today, sometime later. But it was really rough. So the witch trials were so bogus. Go ahead and turn the page. But 5 of them were hung. Now, here's the catch. If during the trials, and I mean they had it in the courthouse with the lawyers questioning them, and it was a big deal. If you said, yes, I am a witch, and I'm so sorry that I went down that path, please forgive me, they would say, okay, if things were all right. If that person said, no, I'm not a witch, they would say, you're not telling the truth. And that's what ended up happening with these people that got hung. And it also affected a member of our family. And her name was Ann Foster. Ann Foster was the mother of a young lady who was married to one of our Russ kin. It says, the piety of Anne Foster is especially spoken of by her sons, and there can be little doubt that she was led to charge herself with the sin of witchcraft in all sincerity and contrition. A broken down old woman in her decrepitude and weakness, torn from her quiet home, brought on a long journey to a prison and a courtroom, accused of blaspheming her God and forsaking her Savior. She overdid in confession, as she would, like the others, have doubtless been saved, but the law must have victims, and here was one that proved to be deeply guilty. She confessed that she bewitched a hog of John Lovejoy, and she caused the death of one of Andrew Allen's children. She made another child sick and hurt Timothy Swan. She said her manner of hurting people was to make images of the persons with rags, poppets she called them, and she would tie knots in the rags or burn them in the fire, and those images were supposed to represent that person, and they would suffer if she pinched or burned the poppet. The deluded old woman also described extraordinary apparitions which she had seen, birds with great eyes, which first were white, and then they became black when they flew away, and she also knew they were devils. She had been at the witch meetings. So all of this thing builds up. You've already been 3 times examined, and yet you do not confess. And she said, I do not confess to being a witch, and I don't confess that my daughter is a witch. And she went through all this process, and then she ended up being in jail for 5 months, where she died. Well, in order to claim her body, her son, who was married to Mary Russ, another daughter of John II, she had to, wait a minute, I'm getting mixed up here. When she confessed, or did not confess, they kept her in jail because things were beginning to change. And her son had to pay 24 pounds to get her out, to claim her dead body, and to pay for the food that she had eaten while she was in jail. and self-injury, wouldn't you say? So it was tough. Okay, go ahead. We're going to be here till midnight. No, we're not. Don't go to sleep. Keep going. Even King James wrote a book about witchcraft. He was really on it. Okay, so here are all these things happening, and a group decides to leave Andover. Now, why would they go? Well, the Indians were a problem. There were so many wolves there that they were a huge problem. When the kids were watching the sheep and cattle out in the fields, they had to be alert because of the wolves. It was a really big problem. As a matter of fact, there's a novel called The Wolves of Andover, if you'd care to read it. It's pretty interesting. And then the access to land was being diminished because so many people were coming in. A lot of things were not going according to what they wanted. So that winter of 96 and 97, 1696 and 97, they had such cold weather that they didn't have much food. It was very brutal. And they said that the ice from Boston to Nantasket was impassable for several months. So it was a big problem. All right, so go ahead. Here comes John III. John III was born in Andover. He married a young woman named Hannah. Her last name was also Russ. It comes out on some of the things you see online as Ross, R-O-S-S, or a couple of variations of that. But Charlotte Helen Abbott, the one I was mentioning earlier, she said that she was from another family strain in Newberry, so they were cousins. And they had been through these hard times in Andover, and an opportunity came up. They decided to move to South Carolina. They decided to move to South Carolina with a group from Dorchester, remember, south of Boston, that group? And when they got to South Carolina, on the banks of the Ashley and the Wando River, just north of Charleston, that's where they settled. And guess what they called their community? Dorchester. And there it sits. It's still there, only not so big and not so famous now. John III came to live with one of his brothers named Jonathan Russ. He was already there. Deborah Osgood's brother, Thomas Osgood, came with the first group. if you want to read about that, it's in the history of the Midway Church. The history of the Midway Church in Liberty County, Georgia. Oh, it's all beginning to come together. So they came to South Carolina and, go ahead, stayed on the farm with John Russ. Jonathan had a warrant for 500 acres of land dated 1705. So that's where they started with the land. In England at that time, bless you, land was not something everybody had access to. The act of primogeniture, that's a $100 word, right? Meant that the oldest son got everything. He got the house, the manor, all the lands, all of the belongings inside the house, and everybody else, see ya. They had to go fend for themselves. And so land was something that they may have never had an opportunity to own. So it was a big deal to come over here and have some. Go ahead. And so they go down from Dorchester. Okay, go to the next one. Keep going on, 6 Charles. They moved to South Carolina, and they were there about 60 years after they had first landed up in Massachusetts. Okay, and Joseph Lord was the minister that was sent down. The group that went first to Dorchester sent a letter back to Andover and said, we need a minister. And at that point in time, all ministers of the Anglican or / Congregational Church were trained at Harvard. I didn't realize Harvard was even existing, but that's where they went. So they set sail December 5th, 1695. Took them about 3 weeks to get down there. Had bad storms. It's all written up in that article. It's really great to read. Go ahead. And little Dorchester was colonized by a group of Puritans from Massachusetts. There it is. Go ahead. And that shows you about where it is. That's the Ashley River. And here's Charleston, all right? Okay, go ahead. This just gives you an idea about, how they came and along the English colonies, along actually the fringe of the Atlantic. Now, when they got to South Carolina, things were set up differently. They were not set up as like counties. It was called a parish because who's in charge? The church. And our group here, St. Thomas and St. Denis, are located here, and St. Andrews is located here. Now, St. Denis was a parish set up for Huguenots. Huguenots came from France, and they had a setup situation that was a little bit different, but they were right there together with our folks using the same church. And some of our family married into that group. There's a family called, if I say it right, Poitevin, and they went to Louisiana, and we'll talk more about that later. But anyway, go ahead. Is it supper time yet? Okay, so within the parish, it's just reiterating. They were responsible for roads, education, the poor and orphans, voting, and collecting taxes as church duties. That's who took care of the business. Okay, go ahead. Now this is just another shot that gives you an idea about where they're located. Go ahead. These are from the Annals of St. Thomas Parish. And guess who's there? John Russ Sr. He passed away in July of 1770. So our family name is all the way through those annals of that church, particular parish. Okay, well, that was not the only Russ that came. John II had his oldest son was named Andrew. And I found this article in a Sunday edition of a newspaper, current newspaper, from the Moultrie News. One of the very first owners, and that is so strange, of land that became Hartford Plantation was a man named Harbin. And Harbin had a young, lovely daughter, and she was married to Andrew Russ. And Harbin lived in Barbados because the islands were big. That's where everybody started off because that was easy to get to. They come down the coast of Europe and Africa and then go straight across to the islands. Although Harbin never came to Carolina, he sent Andrew Russ, his son-in-law, to oversee his property, and Andrew inherited that property, and it's still there. Go ahead. So if you want to go visit, you can take I-95 up to 26 and go over here and visit in Peenhoy, Wando River, South Carolina, when you run out of things to do. Okay, go ahead. So here we have John the Fourth. He was born in St. Thomas Parish, where you just saw, in South Carolina, and he married Sarah Corbett. My next thing to work on, I know you'll be thrilled to hear there's going to be more, is having to do with the Allied families. So I'm trying to find things about Sarah Sally Brown, Henry, and Sarah Corbett and some of these others. So I'm finding some things there that I think could be helpful down the road. Anyway, his father, John III, died when he was just 10 years old. And I never did find a record of her remarrying, so I guess having that group of family around her to help, you know, whatever they needed, that was what they did to sustain themselves. John IV married Mary Wood in St. Andrew's Parish. Go ahead. And here it is. John Russ and Mary Wood, spinster, married July the 12th, 1728. Now, when I read that, I thought, oh my gosh, that's an insult. Why in the world did they write that in there? And I found out, no, it did not mean that she was not, she was an older lady that had not been married. That was not the meaning at the time. Spinster meant that she was a weaver, and that business was so important at the time, it had a title. I mean, you think about it. We just say, oh, you know, I really do need something new to go to that party. Or, you know, Easter's coming and I sure would like a new outfit. That was not what they did. They had to start with, okay, raise the sheep or the cotton or whatever, then I have to spin it into thread, and then I have to weave it, and then so John III was a weaver, and that was his business, but this was really important occupation at the time. Okay, go ahead. St. Andrew's Parish Church is still there. Go ahead. Here's a picture of it. It's kind of tilted, but nonetheless, St. Andrew's Parish. Also, Blackbeard was in the area at the time because Cape Fear is just around the corner, and he was killed in 1718, I think. Go ahead. Go ahead. No with that. Okay, here comes the argument. Everybody's saying, oh, okay, they were in Bladen County, so they must have moved over to Brunswick because I don't know when it happened. I mean, these land things say they're here, they're there. Okay, so in 1740, didn't have a lot of settlement along the Cape Fear River because of the shoals. It was very difficult to navigate, and they had a hard time getting up there. So it was one of the later areas to actually become populated. So here we are, New Hanover right here, and Bladen is known as the mother county of North Carolina because they carved all the rest of them out of Bladen. Okay, go ahead. So here's another one, just kind of gives you an idea. Just from 1740 to 1760, they had come up with quite a few more counties. So here we have New Hanover, remember that one? And then here's Bladen, brought down to size. Right in the middle of Bladen, there's a circle. Okay, go ahead. We're going to talk about that circle. See that little circle again right there in Bladen County? This is 1760. Now watch what happens in 1775. Did that circle move? No, the line moved. Bladen had taken over that area, a while back, and then they carved Brunswick County out of Bladen and New Hanover. And that circle is Lake Waccamaw. So when you read in there about the different family groups moving, because they had land in this county and now they have land in this county, they didn't go anywhere. The county moved. So that's, it's interesting to know because it kind of changes our perspective. So the Russ brothers go to North Carolina. John and Thomas left South Carolina. The other family members stayed in that area. But they went to North Carolina and they had an opportunity for land grants there in 1735. Okay, go ahead. Oh, wait, no, back up. Right there it says that this is from the Hazel Roach kind of little booklet that she did, the information that she had investigated. And she mentions that the land was separated by the northwest branch of Cape Fear River. Well, when I read that, I thought, oh, well, one of them's on this side and one of them's on that side, and they can wave at each other across the river, right? Well, that was challenged. Go ahead. So here it mentions that Thomas Russ was, born in North Carolina, and his family ended up in Mariana. Okay, so that was the family that actually built the Russ House over in Mariana, and they also gave the money for New Hope Methodist Church. Go ahead. So here we have a picture of the Cape Fear River, and you see the northwest branch, and so I'm thinking, okay, southwest side, northeast side, they must be just right there. Okay, keep going. Oh wait, no, go back. Right here it says, the bridge at Lockwood's Folly. Interesting name. Go. So this is a current picture of Google Map. Northeast of the Cape Fear River, there is a Russ Landing. I wonder what his job was. Do you think he might be a ferryman? Okay, go ahead. The reason I put this here is so you can see Lake Waccamaw and where it is in relationship to Brunswick County. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, I don't want this one. All right, I found this little tiny map. It was this big. And I thought, oh, I sure would like to see that. So I brought it out and made it bigger. And guess what I found? Right there it says, Russ. I was thrilled to pieces. I thought that was so exciting. And also up here, Nicole, is where the Goss family lived. Okay, right there. Okay, go to the next one because it's just an extension of that. Now, what we have here is Smithville, no longer that, it's called Southport. But Ben Johnson was the aide-de-camp to George Washington, and he started Smithville. That's why Ben Smith started Smithville. Okay, and so over here you can see the Russ situation a little bit better. And up here you get an idea because Brunswick Town is up on the river. And this is the Cape Fear right here, along through here. Okay, go ahead. Now we have John V. He married Sarah Corbett, and he was a Revolutionary soldier. Go ahead. Guess what? He had a visitor, I think. It was either him or Thomas, but the way it works out. Okay, so George Washington kept a diary of all his travels, and this was his travels through the southern area. Let's see, what does he call it? It's called the his trip south or something, something about the southern area. Go ahead. So in 1791, here's the, okay. In his diary, he said, having sent my carriage across the day before, he was in Wilmington, sent his carriage across the river, I left Wilmington about 6 o'clock in the morning, accompanied by most of the gentlemen of the town, and breakfasting at Mr. Ben Smith's, I lodged at one Russ, 25 miles from Wilmington, an indifferent house. And I thought, you stop. Anyway, go ahead. The next morning, he breakfasted at the Goss house. And it was a little out of the direct road, but after they crossed the boundary of North and South Carolina, then he went to Mr. Cochran's house, and then he also met up with Mr. Vereen. And there is still a place at Vereen's, it's on the South Carolina coast there, where you can go and spend your holiday, and they have it all set up because George Washington was here. Go ahead. So looking at Southwest Cape Fear River, the Russ Ferry, okay, all right, here's the river, and we saw that somebody was up here in the northeast and somebody was down here in the southwest. And Hazel Roach says that John was the one in the southwest. We believe that that's the one where George Washington went to. But also on the southwest side is Russ Ferry. And not only that, there's a Russ town. There's a lot of Russ business over there on that side. Go ahead. So here's Washington's trip. He came from the Waccamaw and went down the coast, and so some of these areas here. Go ahead. Shalott is important because Shalott is an area that a family lived in called Sempronius Russ. Go ahead. Okay, it's also, he said that he was 20 miles from Wilmington, so I was trying to measure it. Okay, from Lake Waccamaw, it's 32.3 miles. Go ahead. And at that time, the states looked something like this: disputed area of Georgia, disputed, not disputed. And Mississippi's over here. West Florida went all the way to the Mississippi River. I-10 would be welcome in those times, wouldn't it? Go ahead. All right, now down here it says something about, okay, here he is. Sempronius Russ died in Brunswick County, North Carolina, where he left a will in 1817. Sempronius Russ, do any of you know him? Have you ever heard that name? That's an unusual name. It was a Praetorian guard in the Roman army. The young man Sempronius Russ ended up marrying a girl from North Carolina named Amelia Potter. And I'm going to tell you something about her in just a minute. But, okay, go ahead. There was also a Russ cemetery on that west side of the Cape Fear River as well. Sempronius Russ, they moved to Hancock, Mississippi. And you need to Google that name, because his children and grandchildren really made names for themselves. There's a big medical center and all kinds of business going on that relates to that family. But he died in 1816 in Brunswick County. Go ahead. And Amelia Potter, hold on. Anyway, her diary is online, and the red dots give you an idea about where they were. And what struck me was how many rivers they had to cross to get to Mississippi. So they left Charlotte, that I just showed you, and they traveled all the way through from North Carolina into Georgia, into Alabama, over to Mississippi. And it's just an amazing thing. I was just blown away with it. I just love the detail. But you can also look that up online, because the Hancock Historical Society has a lot of little stories about early pioneers there. So you might enjoy looking at some of those things. I wanted to give you just a little vignette about hers, and I promise I will allow you to leave at some point. It was a 45-day trip. They only averaged about 18 miles a day. Some days a couple of miles more, some days a few miles less. But this is just sort of like an overall view. A diary with daily entries written by Miss Adam, it is really Amelia Russ. And they ended up at Pearlington, Mississippi, which is very near New Orleans. If you went that way in an automobile today, it'd probably take, a day or so, but it took them 45 days. In making this long and arduous trip in the cold and rain of winter, because they left in February, they crossed over mud roads, sometimes no roads at all, just passed through the wilderness. And the reason this was interesting to me is because they left in 1829, and I believe that James Russ, having passed away in 1827, I believe our family was making a similar trek from that area to, Conecuh County, Alabama, and northwest Florida. So I thought it was a wonderful parallel to have an idea about what kind of things they endured. Many of Andrew Jackson's soldiers came back to this lovely land they had passed through on their way to New Orleans, often being mustered out in the spring of 1815 after the Battle of New Orleans. It's most probable that Samuel Russ was a soldier in Jackson's artillery and had passed through Pearlington to the battle which so devastated the British in January 1815. When Samuel moved there, Samuel Russ, he must have sent back glowing accounts because they were all very interested in going to that part. When the group from North Carolina arrived in April 1829, they found him with a sick wife and 5 children. According to the record, his wife died in May, just a few weeks before they arrived. And Mary Russ, the oldest child of Samuel, married Bill Poitevin. Remember, he was from the St. Denis Parish. And they started from Little River, so yeah, that's right next to Shalott. I just want to, go ahead, Chris. They started on this side, and I'm thinking that they followed the federal road here once they got to Alabama and came over to Claiborne before going into Mississippi. But this is what started it all. I was just fascinated because I know that David May went to Texas, and I thought, well, dang, if there were no roads to Texas, how in the world did he know where to go? Well, of course, all of the rivers at that time, that was the interstate, okay? So that's how they traveled long distances, was usually by water. And then they, the early years of the United States, they began to have some of these roads. They were animal trails that became Indian paths, that became postal service kinds of areas or ways to get from one place to another. So it evolved, and that was something, it was called the Federal Road, but no federal money went into it. Interesting. People were responsible for taking care of certain parts of it, and they were assigned an area and what they were supposed to do and when they were supposed to do it. And it was on the neighborhoods in the area that took care of the roads. Okay, go ahead. That's an interesting thing to pursue, too. So James VI married Sarah Sally Brown. They had these children that we know of through WCF's Sketches and Limbs. And we have some information, but Sally, I think she came with John, Julius, Jackson, Russ. I think she came with him. I don't think she came later, because she ended up passing away in 1830, and James had passed away in 1827. I don't think she would have traveled by herself. I mean, when you read about how arduous it was to make that trip. So about the same time, the Russes in North Carolina were migrating. They probably discussed it and made plans, or, you know, they knew what the other ones were doing, and I just think that she came along then. But that's, you know, just my thoughts. Okay, go ahead. Okay, and then we have John Julius Jackson Russ, who, according to WCF, he filled many trusts in his life. We can certainly be impressed by the length of duties that he had, such as clerk of circuit court in 1857 after the Civil War. He served in the Indian War and Civil War. He was a school teacher, tax assessor for Washington County, and a Methodist circuit rider preacher. Okay, now, are we going to be able to do that one little thing? And then I'll let y'all go. The video. Do you think we can? Go to the next. Keep going. In 1850, he was a farmer. I think WCF says he was a circuit rider from 1853. In 1860, in the census, it says he was a Methodist minister. So go to the next one. Let's see. I don't know if we can do it. We didn't try it with your stuff. Oh, John Wesley came to South Carolina in the 1700s, late 1700s, and I thought that was so interesting because he and his brother Charles came to Savannah, and that's the seat of Methodism. Go ahead. Next one, and the next one. The circuit riders had a big job. They had to preach every single day. They would go to one community and preach. Next day they go to the next community. They were housed at the places that the congregation would, you know, keep them overnight. And let's see. Oh, here it is.
Rifle on his saddle and a Bible in his hand. He told the prairie people all about the promised land. He went riding, singing down the trail. Leading, safe and secure from all loss. Leading on the everlasting arms. The circuit riding preacher traveled through the fire and mud, wrote about the fiery furnace and of Noah and the flood. He preached the way to heaven, won by water and the blood. He went riding, singing down the trail. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. as it hangs upon the wall. Bible worn and tattered, it cannot be read at all. Till today he rides the prairie to fulfill the gospel call. He goes riding, singing down the trail. Are you washed in the blood, in the soul cleansing blood of the Lamb? Are your garments spotless? Are they white as snow? Are you washed in the blood?
He's the bass.
Have you been to Jesus for the cleansing power? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in His grace this hour? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you washed in the blood, in the soul cleansing blood of the Lamb? Are your garments spotless? Are they white as snow? Are you washed
That short little guy in the middle. There he is. You see him right in the middle?
daily by the Savior's side? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Do you rest each moment in the crucified? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you washed in the blood, in the soul cleansing blood of the Lamb? Are your garments spotless? Are they white as snow? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Lay aside the garments that are stained with sin and be washed with the blood of the Lamb. There's a fountain flowing for the soul unclean. Oh, be washed in the blood of the Lamb. Are you washed in the blood, in the soul cleansing blood of the
I tell you, when I hear that song, I end up singing it the rest of the day, because Methodists do love to sing. Thank you for your attention, and I appreciate you sticking with me.